Dream number 45, Part 2, October 11th, 2017. It's been 7 years since the incident of the old man that passed, who owned the art machine. A lot has taken place since then. My ex-wife and I had split and went our own direction in life. I live by myself now, and one day I decided to go to the supermarket and get some art supplies for myself. As I walked into the supermarket, on the left side wall, there's this bulletin board. I happened to see the same thing week after week. Pictures of all the missing children. Normally I'd walk past them, but this time I stopped and actually looked. For some reason, by looking at all these children brought back memories of when my wife and I were together. I eventually ended up staying in the area while they both moved to a safer location. Soon I came to and continued my way into the store. There were only a few items I needed, so I tried to stick to my list. About 15 minutes had passed, and I had already went through 2/3 of the things I needed to put in my cart. And then something caught my eye, and I began to slow down. My eyes noticed some small paint containers that were sitting there in order, color coordinated. At that moment, I had flashbacks of that very day I came home and saw that machine sitting in my lawn. Matter of fact, the last time I had heard about the machine was when the police officers had taken it in as evidence. Well, it's been 7 years now, and nobody has heard anything, and the children are still missing. But deep down inside, I have a feeling that they're connected somehow. As I was checking out of the store, go to the police station where this thing was taken in. As I exited through the double doors, the wind had hit me. It was fall time this time of year, and kind of depressing in a way. I put my bags in my car, started my vehicle, and drove off and began my way to the police station. Once I had pulled in and turned my vehicle off, I was thinking to myself, was this a good idea? Soon I snapped out of it and decided to open the door and marched my way into the police station. Once I had walked inside, the lady at the front desk had asked if I could be helped in any way. I said, yeah, I'd like to know about a specific item that was brought in a few years back. She smiled and said someone would get with me in a moment, and to please take a seat in the waiting room. I looked and noticed I was the only one there waiting. I think I stared at the clock for 10 minutes, being as patient as I possibly could, still wondering if this was a good idea. Soon an older police officer had entered the room. I smiled, stood up, and shook his hand. I said, yes, sir. I have a few questions I'd like to ask. I had mentioned about the machine, and his face went blank. He told me to follow him, and soon we ended up walking down this long hallway. Soon we entered a small room, and he turned on the lights. There was a small table and a chair on each side of it. With a vanilla envelope just sitting there on the table. Soon we both took a seat, and we sat across from each other as he slid the envelope in my direction. Before I picked up the envelope, he had reached in the back pocket and grabbed his wallet. He opened his wallet and pulled out a picture of a little girl and slid it across the table for me to look at. He looked at me and asked me if I knew who she was, and with a blank face I said, "No, sir, I've never seen this child before." He looked at me again and said it was his daughter, that she had been missing for 5 months now. He then told me to keep the picture just in case I do happen to see her somewheres. He then got right to the point and asked me what interest I have in this machine. I took a deep breath and I realized, man, this is going to end up being a lot bigger of an issue than I had intended. Anyway, I had spent the next hour discussing what had happened 7 years ago. It seemed like it happened yesterday. That's how fresh it was in my mind. After telling him what I remembered, he paused, and he could remember that machine being brought in 7 years ago as well. From his own personal opinion, he thought it was a machine built with evil intentions. He then said after doing multiple internet searches, he found out he was right. Soon the investigator took the vanilla envelope and began taking pictures out of it. One in particular picture was a picture of the machine itself. I looked up at the investigator and I said, "Do you by chance still have the machine in your possession?" He slowly leaned forward and said, "It disappeared about a week after they took it in." He then reached in the envelope and slid me another photo. He said during the week it was here, one morning one of the deputies came in and heard an engine-like noise coming from the back room. So he went to see what it was, and once he opened the back door, the machine had turned off. He then said the second picture that was slid in front of me was of what the machine had painted on that canvas. It was a painting of a building with an old railroad that came up from behind it. It was like an abandoned warehouse. He then continued on by saying that from what little research he had done, the machine was built sometime in the early 1900s, and there was a man that had dreamt of building a machine that did art on its own. The only problem was the machine needed a soul, and the man who built it was involved in the dark arts. He somehow casted a ritual that united his spirit with the machine itself, and once he was plugged into it, it turned on and killed the man who created it. And ever since, the spirit is what's been operating this thing, causing people to hook themselves up to it and dying as it painted pictures. He knew the story seemed a bit far-fetched. I also had a difficulty believing what he said, but deep inside, I still asked the question of how many missing children were involved. After looking at it a couple different times, I brought the image closer. I had noticed something on the side of the building. It was a sign. You can only see the last part of it saying Children's Home. At that moment I remembered as a child living in a city that had a building like this. This building apparently had housed abandoned children at one point. I then slid the photo back to him. I didn't recognize anything. Soon the investigator stood up and shook my hand. He thanked me for coming in. As I left the police department, I knew what I needed to do. I got into my vehicle, started it up. I knew I was too involved now to stop, and drove off. As I continued driving, I had many thoughts go through my mind. But before I was able to make it home, I happened to have noticed that same building that I saw in that photo the police officer had shown me. As seen in the photo, I also saw the railroad tracks coming from behind the building. I then pulled in. Once I had parked and turned off the car, I was overwhelmed with anxiety. I knew I couldn't back down now, and began to walk myself into this abandoned warehouse. As I approached the entrance, I had noticed that the door was off its hinges. There was no activity here for a very long time. Everything was dark and musty. I had no idea what I was looking for or where to look at all. I didn't feel like I belonged here, but something had told me that I needed answers. Soon I had noticed a cement stairway that went up a few floors. I had decided to walk up them. I had heard a noise getting louder and louder. It sounded like a motor running. I began to get nervous, and I had wiped away the sweat from my head and continued on. After passing through about 6 floors, I arrived. I began to take it slow. I then walked down this long hallway and came to a room that was dark. I then pulled out my cell phone to get a better idea of where I was, and noticed the windows had blinds. I then pulled every blind up and couldn't believe what I saw. The entire room was filled with paintings of children on the walls. At that moment, I pulled out that photo that investigator gave me, and it matched one of the paintings of his daughter. Soon I turned my head towards another area, and I heard a sound coming from behind the doorway. I watched as I saw this machine pumping paint through it. I began to walk slowly around it, and I quickly fell to the ground in unbelief. I could not believe what I was seeing in front of my eyes as this machine was pumping and painting. Soon my cell phone rang. It was my ex-wife. To be continued.